Welcome to Understanding Oklahoma, a series of conversations looking at the richness, but also the complexity of the cultures and histories that contribute to Oklahoma's distinctive identity. I am so pleased today to have this wonderful guest with us, Dr. Mirelsie Velazquez, an historian of education who deals with race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, Puerto Rican studies, critical race theory, and Latina feminism. Her forthcoming book chronicles the Puerto Rican community's response in Chicago to the urban decay in which they were forced to work, live, and especially learn. Her work has most recently appeared in the journals Latino Studies, Centro, and Gender and Education. Welcome to this segment, Melanie. Wonderful to have you here. Could you give us an overview of Latinas in Oklahoma?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. Part of when we're talking about Latina, Latino, Latinx communities in Oklahoma, it's important to really think about how, when, where they settled, when they were coming, and who exactly was coming. And there's so much work that still needs to be done as part of that conversation. But the little bit that has been done is very gendered. We only look at migration through male-centered migration, right? We look at who was coming for work, but we don't think about the families that were coming with them. We don't think about the ways in which they were building community, which needs to be unpacked further, and we need to reinsert Latinas in particular into that part of the conversation. I always remind my students, think about what home means to you. I ask them, what communities where were you coming from? And really look backwards and think about who really started those spaces that you really valued. In Oklahoma, sometimes that means church, sometimes that means schools, right? Restaurants, the places that we visit. I look at, something like Little Flower Church in Southside Oklahoma City, right? That this year celebrates 100 years. Always has been a Mexican church. And so when we think about it, that means for at least 100 years, that community has been a Mexican community in Oklahoma. And we don't think about it through that lens. And if we want to gender it even further, who were the ones that were bringing those spaces, those celebrations, and creating community? It's usually Latinas that build those community spaces and are central to these conversations, even if we don't put them as part of the story.
I see what you mean, because so often people talk about men coming to the state, working in the coal mines and on the railroads. So were there Latinas in Oklahoma prior to, I guess, throughout the 19th century or at the end of the 19th century?
From the little bit that I've been able to uncover, they're there. You find wedding photos, you find them in the wedding registry. Where exactly they were meeting, we don't know. Access to travel wasn't as readily available as it is now. So it could have been that they were marrying the daughters of their co-workers in those spaces, which means that they were also coming with family members in those spaces. The railroad, of course, played a big role in that. The coal mine played a big role in that. And they were still centering religious activities as part of their family and community lives. They were here. We just don't put them as part of the conversations. Many of them were opening up restaurants because they were looking to find ways to be able to center themselves as part of the economic base in Oklahoma. And so they were here. Who are they as part of the conversation and the work that I know I'm trying to get my students to kind of uncover just a little bit more.
This is important work. My guess is we're talking about mainly people from Mexico at this point, but it could be, we don't know, it could be Latin America, it could be the Caribbean. So what do you think was life, what everyday life was like for Latinas in Oklahoma in the late 19th, early 20th century?
I like to think that it was very familiar to them, right? If we really want to look at history, the panhandle of Oklahoma was part of what was ceded in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? So when we're thinking about land base, it was very familiar. And it's also tied to indigenous communities as well, because many of their communities spanned what we now call the border between the United States and Mexico. So they were primarily Mexican, right, until about the mid-20th century is when we see people coming from other countries, especially for work, for professional reasons, and also to attend higher education. University of Oklahoma being part of that conversation too, which I've been able to make connections to Puerto Rico, to the University of Oklahoma in the mid-20th century as well. And so I think it was very familiar if you look at where they were settling. They were settling in rural communities, which if we look at the landscape, it's gonna look very similar to what they were experiencing. However, what they were probably confronting and dealing with when they came to this space, especially around the racial conflict that existed within this space, was probably what's gonna shift these relationships and probably moved them into what then became urban communities, especially Tulsa and Oklahoma City.
Could you isolate a few concerns that people would have had at that time, say late 19th, early 20th century? And I'm not trying to suggest that all Latinos had the same perspective, but there probably were issues that were maybe dealt with or not dealt with that ran across the community. What would those have been?
Language, right? Not familiarity with language in particular spaces. One of my upcoming projects is really historicizing parochial schools in Oklahoma because of the influx of Latino, Latinx communities within those spaces, right? They were going to gravitate to parochial schools like they do in larger communities as well. And in those spaces, their language was probably going to be honored and respected a little differently because some of the religious people, who were teaching in those spaces tend to be multilingual. So language was not going to be a negative thing within parochial schools in Oklahoma the way that maybe in public education spaces in Oklahoma. So I think language was probably one of the big issues that they faced. Not knowing who this population was going to be another one. What box do we check when we're talking about this community in the early 20th century? Which was a conversation that was happening in Texas, in California, in Illinois, in Minnesota, as we saw an increase in Spanish-speaking populations in those communities. So I really think I don't think there were unique problems in Oklahoma, but we don't center Oklahoma when we're talking about Latino, Latinx history. And so to me, I'm really interested to looking at the same ways that they were facing problems around education, language, how to even racialize them in these spaces, was something that was going to link them to larger communities outside of Oklahoma. So I imagine that those were the conversations that they were having. Those were the issues that they were having. How are they going to view themselves within the already very tense racial conflict that was happening in Oklahoma? How then were Spanish-speaking Latino, Latinx population going to fit within that narrative as well?
I'm not sure the faculty always understand who's coming through the door when they have Latinx students. Could you talk about maybe some of the issues that are really live issues now out of the Latino community and something that really might be helpful for those that haven't really, faculty, teachers, haven't really focused on that community enough?
It's sad that the same issues that they're facing in here is what actually reminded me of home, because it was the exact same conversations and issues that I faced as an undergraduate student myself. People not understanding our familial backgrounds, the ways that we engage and we're connected to our communities very differently. They think that language is the number one thing that we're dealing with. And for some people, yeah, I didn't speak English until I was 7, 8 years old. And so I'm familiar with that background as well. But that's not the only thing that we're dealing with. And so our students here are coming from under-resourced schools. There's this narrative that Latinos don't care about education. I like to think our parents care too much about education, the way that the way our family structured and how they centered education in school as something that we're supposed to be working towards, right? And that's not how they're viewed when they enter places of higher education, right? That they value or understand education in that space. But that's part of our community life. Education has always been part of our community life. And so when they walk in the doors at the University of Oklahoma, I see myself in a lot of different ways. And I would push my colleagues to also think about ways to connect with them, but not look at them through this deficit model, because they really want to be part of this community, but they also want to be part of this community under their own terms as well.
What do they bring, not what they don't bring?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I guess generation, age, of course, is an obvious factor here. But what I notice a lot is that students who come through the doors of a place like OU, they can't often talk about their education, what's happening with their parents as well, because their parents don't understand English and maybe don't know as much about the school as they do. So that's what generation they are, really, it's important, isn't it?
It is. And, and a lot of us are familiar with that, right? Not being able to go home and have someone fill out our financial aid records. Where do we look for scholarship? What does office hours mean? And not having kind of that narrative of going home and asking these questions. I remind my own daughters, you're at an advantage because your dad and I went through that process. And so you can come to us and ask us questions and we can help you. But that's not the same thing for everybody. And so sometimes there's that generational divide, because then those parents don't understand or are trying to connect with their kids, but there's something missing between what these kids are experiencing or these young adults are now experiencing in higher education and their parents want them to succeed, but there's almost this sense of loss in not being able to connect with one another, especially because we come from communities that center community life, family life as being important. But what happens when there's something dividing us in particular ways? We manage it, we figure out ways to, include community, and maybe we need to do better as an institution to bring in communities and make them feel like they're part of it, and not just the students, but their families have to be part of that conversation as well.
I think the University of Oklahoma is doing some of its recruitment in Spanish now, and that really must be very helpful to just get everybody involved and on the same page. Also, social class is going to be a big factor. Could you talk about that a little bit?
And that's the thing. We assume that all of our, students of color are coming from working class backgrounds, and that's actually not even the case anymore in a space like this. Doesn't mean that there aren't going to be things dividing us and conversations we have to have. But social class is still, an issue that we need to work through and try to understand and talk through. That means that we're going to have to work a little harder to create access and resources for particular communities if we really want education to be meaningful, if we really want education here to be an extension of what we want to do and transform the communities that these students are coming from. And we have to have that conversation. That class, there is going to be a class divide. There's always going to be a class divide, right? But how do we engage in conversations in which it's not going to be the thing that keeps them from succeeding while they're at the University of Oklahoma or anywhere else that they decide to attend higher education, right? And so how do we bring those conversations together?
So it really needs to be the responsibility of the place to not see any group as monolithic from the same class having the same issues, because they don't. Gender identity. I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who are not in a kind of binary gender role, but could have all kinds of different gender identities these days.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've really enjoyed in the last 6 years of being at OU is seeing these conversations come out even more in different spaces, right? I think as an institution, we're doing a really good job at creating inclusive spaces around gender identity. I'm looking at the Gender Equality Center, even the celebration that they've been doing this month for Women's History Month. They've been looking at Latinx communities. They've been looking at Latinas that are really foundational to the ways that we look at our own identity, right? They've talked about Gloria Saldúa, they're talking about Sonia Sotomayor, they're talking about people that, our students, our community, our, Latina students can look and see they see me, I see them, and they understand who I am, at least at that foundational space. So I think as an institution, we're doing the work. People are asking questions about how do we become a little more inclusive, not just, through this, like you said, this monolithic lens, right? Looking at people as the same, but understanding the complexity of how our gendered, our racialized, our linguistic and cultural backgrounds need to be part of that conversation as well.
Would you mind speaking just a little more personally about all of this? Maybe you could tell us about some experiences you've had in this state, at this university, good and bad, but really provide a kind of focus, sort of, real just distinct look at what it's like.
The one thing that's made me feel like I've really found community here and I can build a home in this space is my relationship to really more the Latina students that I've met and have I encountered, right? And seeing the way in which they're transforming, not just their own lives, but the communities that they're coming from. And so whenever I see one of them post on social media of an organization that they're a part of, especially in Southside Oklahoma City, and looking at the work that they're doing, and also using the language of the conversations that started maybe in my Latina feminism class, I feel like, okay, I've done one thing. And maybe that one thing is going to mean something to a young person in the community that I now call home. And so to me, that's meaningful. And so I've had such positive experiences when I'm working with these students and when I'm learning from them and when I'm engaging. And once in a while, I'll get a message from them, a text message, and they'll say, thank you. And I'll say, actually, no, thank you, because I survive here because of you. And they think that we're doing something for them. And the whole time I'm thinking, oh no, you're doing a lot more for me to be able to call this place home and to be able to feel like I belong in a particular community because of the way that you're growing, because of the way that you're extending the knowledge that we're engaging with you with, and you're extending that and taking that back to your community.
Building community together.
Community together.
Yeah. Give us, if you wouldn't mind, 2 or 3 takeaways from this conversation that would lead people in the right direction.
Ask questions. don't just assume that students aren't connecting with you, but ask the type of questions of your colleagues, of the staff on campus, so that you can build a better place for these communities, for these students to flourish and to create a sense of home and belonging within this institution, right? I think, we say that to students, ask questions, but do we say that to each other? Do we say that to our colleagues to make sure that they're asking the type of questions that are going to make sure that that's going to be meaningful if we're going to engage in creating transformative spaces like in this community? Don't be afraid to explore and to learn from people that maybe you're not familiar with. I think right now, more than ever, we really need to be having conversations with one another. And I think that learning from each other, we have such a rich and diverse population on this campus that we really should be learning more from. And we think of them as, oh, they're here to learn from us, when really, no, they're here to add something in terms of how we view ourselves as a larger community, right? And don't be afraid to ask for help. I think, we really do need to learn how to take care of one another. And I think if anything, the last year has really taught us is that we really need to help one another. And we really need to think about, if this is a place that I value, how do I change it or create it so that someone else coming into this space can also see home when they look at Oklahoma.
The other thing I heard you say, Melly, and it just seems so valuable and important to me, is that I think you said this a couple of different ways in what you said, is don't be afraid to go to them. Be at their events. Follow up on their projects. Just don't sit back safe waiting for them to come to you, but throw yourself out there and get involved. And that seems so important to me.
No, it is. And a couple of years ago, I actually was able to bring a speaker that someone I admire in education work, and I really wanted an opportunity to engage with him. So what do? You invite him to campus to give a talk. And instead of showing the film on campus, we actually show the film at one of the high schools in Southside Oklahoma City. Because the work is tied to what does it mean to work with Latino families, right? That's part of what he engages in. So we took the film to the school. Parents came, students came, teachers came, right? And so I think about, and my colleagues came, they all came to support the event as well. It's okay to do that. If we're really thinking about the ways in which we want to work with the larger community, let's not just close ourselves off here on campus, right? What would we be able to do if they see us in those spaces? If we take the film, the resources that we have as an institution to the community themselves, I guarantee they will show up if you invite them. And I think that, to me, we need to be willing to do that.
Oh, that was a really powerful thought. Dr. Velazquez, thank you so much for being here for this segment today. Thank you for joining us. Please check out other segments of Understanding Oklahoma. You take care.